Welcome again to lecture series at Green Lake Church. I'm Dana Waters, and I'm your host for this evening's presentation by Dr. Titus Kennedy on biblical archaeology, excavating the Bible. The focus of this evening is on Exodus. I'll introduce him soon, but first let me tell you a bit about lecture series. Lecture series at Green Lake has a long history beginning in 1969 with a spring lecture series that lasted nearly a week. Can you imagine? This subsequently and shortly contracted to a much more manageable, but still very focused weekend. A fall lecture series began in 1977, and these twice yearly traditions have enriched the spiritual life of the congregation and have been opportunities for church members to enlarge their perspective on many topics. As I review the long list of speakers, I see persons with expertise in theology, religion and the arts, religion and music, archaeology, social issues as related to the Christian life. And in pre-COVID times, right now, we would have just enjoyed a potluck supper of soup and fruit and dessert as we talked around tables in the church fellowship hall. I really miss that. However, I hope all of you enjoyed your suppers solo or with friends and family this evening. I'm grateful that we can still be together tonight and tomorrow and continue the lecture series enrichment via Zoom. Big thank you to Tad for managing the electronic connections this evening that allow us to do that. A little housekeeping before I introduce Dr. Kennedy. Please mute yourselves to avoid background noise. As you saw in the introductory slide, which Tad will put up again at the end of the meeting, use the same Zoom link that you did tonight for tomorrow's 9:30 and tomorrow afternoon's Q&A session. Use the usual link for the worship service at 11. Note your questions tonight and tomorrow. You can put them into the chat tonight. You can enter them tonight or tomorrow morning, and they'll be answered in the Q&A tomorrow afternoon. You also have opportunity to ask questions verbally at the chat tomorrow afternoon, and I'm sure we will have a lot of them, and I just relish the opportunity to be able to ask questions. So please pray with me and enjoy God's presence as we do. Thank you, Lord, for this time that we can spend together to learn and to deepen our knowledge and understanding of the biblical world. Please bless Dr. Kennedy as he shares with us. We ask that this time with him be profitable and be illuminating, and that what we see and what we learn enriches our appreciation and knowledge of your word to us in the scriptures. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Titus Kennedy, the presenter for the series. As you saw in the introductory slide, and I found a bio on the web, it says Dr. Titus Kennedy is a field archaeologist working primarily with sites and materials related to the Bible. He's been involved in excavations, I'm sure starting as a digger, and later as a field supervisor, and even later as a director, which is, I think, the prime place to be, rather than being one of the lowly diggers, and has performed surveys at sites in the biblical world. I think you call them sightseeing, isn't that right?
That's right.
Yeah, he's conducted artifact research at museums and collections around the world. His archaeological interests include biblical archaeology, the interplay between ancient documents and the archaeological record, experimental archaeology, and I'm certainly going to ask what that means tomorrow, ancient demography, that's the study of human populations, and the similarities and differences between the cultures of antiquity. Currently, he's a research fellow at the Discovery Institute, teaches as an adjunct professor at Biola University in California, and recently has been a consultant, a writer, and a guide for history and archaeology documentaries and curricula. He's published a number of articles in the field of biblical archaeology and history, and recently wrote a book focusing on archaeological artifacts connected to the Bible. And we can also ask him about that tomorrow afternoon. And I imagine that features large in his presentations today and tomorrow. We're so glad you're with us this weekend, Dr. Kennedy. Take it away.
Thank you for having me, and welcome to our first session of biblical archaeology. So I am just going to switch to the screen share and we can start. So we're going to begin with Exodus. Tonight we'll do Exodus, and then tomorrow morning we're going to look at Joshua, continuing this time period. And then our final session will jump ahead to Acts and Paul, followed by a Q&A session. So if you have any questions that come up during this session or the next two, you can put those in the chat, you can write them down, you can just remember them, and then we'll do all the questions together after the service tomorrow. So the Exodus is one of my favorite stories in the Bible. It's very, very controversial. You may or may not know that in terms of professional historians and archaeologists. It's also one of the most important stories in the Bible. It connects historically and theologically, even to the New Testament. So what are some of the viewpoints that scholars take on this? Because I think it's important for us to understand what some of the views are out there, what they've developed into in more recent history. For example, I have two quotations here from archaeologists. The first is by William Deaver. He says, "Not only is there no archaeological evidence for such an exodus, there is no need to posit such an event. I regard the historicity of the Exodus as a dead issue." So that's one perspective, is that scholars don't even look into it anymore. Archaeologists, Egyptologists, they consider the issue closed. They think there's no evidence for the Exodus. It's a myth, and so we'll go on with our lives and studies. Another archaeologist, Zev Herzog, says, "The Israelites were never in Egypt, did not wander in the desert. The many Egyptian documents that we have make no mention of the Israelites' presence in Egypt and are also silent about the events of the Exodus." So these are two, we could put them in the skeptical camp as far as the Exodus history. And they would say no. So what are they claiming? No Egyptian texts exist that are talking about the Israelites. They say no Egyptian references to the events of the Exodus. And then they say there's no archaeological material that connects to the Exodus. So that is really the mainstream stance now in academia. So if you go read a book about the Exodus that is not from a more biblical, literal perspective, then you're probably going to see them claim that the Exodus is myth. Now, I put up here on the right-hand side of the screen a fragment of a scroll, and that is from what's called 4Q Exodus F. So that means it was found in Cave 4 at Qumran. It's one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's our oldest manuscript of Exodus that we have right now. It dates to about the 3rd century BC, so very, very old. But of course, the Exodus happened long before that and was written down long before that. And that's one reason, at least this is a stated reason, why many scholars claim that the Exodus and other stories in the Old Testament are myth. They say that, the manuscripts we have, or when they were written down, is so much later than they supposedly happened that they can't be considered reliable sources. And so it's basically innocent and guilty until proven innocent. And so we have to show all this archaeological evidence from the story of Exodus in order to be convincing, or to say that, look, the book of Exodus does have historical evidence. But as we've seen in these quotes, generally, most scholars today are going to say there's no evidence for the Exodus. Now, I'm going to go through evidence for the Exodus and counter that, but this is, again, the general stance in academia. Now, beyond the question of history versus myth for the Exodus, we also have two perspectives on the chronology. So, for those who do think that the Exodus happened, there's either those who say it happened in the 15th century BC or those who believe it happened in the 13th century BC. So this 13th century stance used to be quite popular, and in fact, it was sort of mainstream at one point, but now myth has become the mainstream. So most archaeologists now, or ancient historians who think that the Exodus actually happened, most of them now would say it happened in the 15th century. And that's what we're going to look at. And we don't have time tonight to go into all the reasons for that, but I will show you how we get to this 15th century BC date. Now, first of all, the setting of the Exodus, it's in Egypt. And specifically, it's in Lower Egypt, which is the northern part of ancient Egypt. And you see there the Nile Delta region. Again, that is primarily where the Exodus story happened. In fact, there are some cities shown there on the map. For example, we have Avaris here, if you can see where the little laser pointer is. And then we have Heliopolis down here, just north of Cairo. So those are two that are actually mentioned in the text. Okay, Avaris, Heliopolis, and then Pithom is another one, and that is located out in this area. Here's a closer view map with some of these sites. We're going to look at a couple of the sites. So if we go back to Genesis in the time of Joseph, we're told that the Israelites lived in what was called the land of Ramses. It's also called the land of Goshen. Even in Exodus chapter 8, it's called the land of Goshen. So it had two different names, but again, this is the Nile Delta region. So it's an area where they have a lot of water, so they're able to farm and live there. Whereas you get away from the Nile River in Egypt, and it's barren desert. Very hard to survive there. So this site right here is called Tel El Daba, or Avaris. We're going to talk about that. That's the same location as Ramses. Down here you have the location of Pithom, and then again Heliopolis. There were other cities, of course, but they're not all mentioned by name in the Exodus narrative. This site right here might be mentioned. We'll talk about that closer to the end. So we do have some geographical markers, though, that show up in the text, and this is a marker of a historical text. You think about mythology. Usually the events happen in these made-up places that don't exist. But we can see in Exodus, it's a very real setting. We have Ramses, Pithom, Heliopolis. Fortresses are mentioned right here, Migdal. That is the word for fortress. The Reed Sea is mentioned. All right, so the Nile River, of course. So they're real places in Egypt. So at least the setting, we could say, is geographically accurate to ancient Egypt. Now, the second thing we need to look at before we get into the details is the chronology, because we can't just pull something from this period and something from this period and something from that location and this location and then say, oh, it all goes together. The Exodus happened. We have to actually look at specifics and our parameters. If we're evaluating the text of the Bible, our parameters have to fit what the biblical text and what the book of Exodus or related passages are telling us. So our main chronological passage for the chronology of the Exodus comes from 1 Kings 6:1, because it's talking about an event in reference to the Exodus from Egypt. And it says, in the 480th year after the Israelites came up out of Egypt, in the 4th year of King Solomon's reign over Israel. So it tells us that in the 4th year of King Solomon's reign. It was the 480th year after the Exodus. Now we know when Solomon was king, and we know that because of a lot of synchronisms, okay, so combining information from other king lists, other nations in ancient times. This is agreed upon by basically all historians and archaeologists, that Solomon started his reign about 970, 971 BC. So his fourth year, after 3 years, starts his fourth, was about 967 BC. And so then we just add 479 years. Again, 480th means that 479 had been completed. And so they're starting the 480th. And that puts the Exodus in about 1446 BC. Yes, we could say plus or minus a year there. That's fine. It's not going to throw us off. There's a secondary passage in Judges 11:26 that tells us in the time of Jephthah that Israel had already been in the land, settled for about 300 years. And we know roughly when Jephthah was a judge and when this was happening. We add about 300 years to 1100 BC. We add the 40 years in the wilderness, and we get again into the same time frame, 1440s BC. So that is not so debated. Again, there are people who take those numbers figuratively, but we're not going to get into that tonight. So if we look at 1446 BC and then we look at Egyptian history, we can see when in Egyptian history this occurred. So Egypt is usually arranged according to dynasties. And in 1446 BC, we drop down here, that's in what's called the 18th dynasty. So there was the beginning of a new kingdom at the start of this 18th dynasty. So there's a transition there. So we're going to be looking at some things in this 18th dynasty of Egypt. And some of you may have seen a documentary or read something that there's a rearrangement of Egyptian chronology. And yes, these proposals have been around for almost a century of changing, or drastically changing, I should say, Egyptian chronology. There are tweaks here and there that Egyptologists have made over the years, but they're small, a few years here and there, maybe 40 or 50 in some of the lesser known periods, but not 300 plus. So there are almost no scholars who accept a radical revision of the Egyptian chronology. So we're going with the standard chronology here. Now, once we have that setting, the story really starts with the migration into Egypt from Canaan. We see in Exodus 1:1, it says, "These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob." So they come into Egypt. That's when the Israelites or the Hebrews start living there. And we can see from archaeology and Egyptian artwork that, yes, indeed, this was something that was happening. People around the time of Jacob and Joseph were moving from Canaan into Egypt, and it was allowed. The Egyptians allowed it at that time. Later on, they did not. These people were free to live and settle there. Later on, they were not. They were part of a group that were enslaved by the Egyptians. So we see an example on the Egyptian tomb painting here at the bottom from the tomb of Khnum-Hotep II. He was an Egyptian politician, a local ruler, and this comes from about 1870 BC. And you see there at the very front on the far right, there's an Egyptian man. He is leading these people. He's taking them to where they're going to settle. And then behind him, you see a few men, some pack animals. There's a donkey at the far left. There's actually a child on the donkey. If we went farther back, you would see some women and some more children also. So it's a group of 37 people, actually. There's a hieroglyphic Egyptian text that gives us a little bit more information about that. Also, when the site of Avaris, Ramses, was excavated by archaeologists, and it's still undergoing excavation, but it has been for many decades now. They found there in this pre-Exodus and Exodus period, they found tools and weapons from Canaan, or of the type that Canaanites and people living in Canaan made. They found temple architecture and gods that had been imported from Canaan. So this is more evidence that people from Canaan moved into Avaris, Ramses area. They found a specific type of sheep bones all over the place, buried outside the city, and they were a long-haired variety of sheep which came from the Levant, the area of Canaan. So we see that shepherds actually brought their sheep into Egypt at this time. And over 20% of the pottery that they excavated could be classed as a Canaanite type. So some of it they may have imported, others they made there, and they continued the same styles. And then finally on the right, you see this statue head. So there was a monumental tomb, that means it's a very large, fancy tomb, that had a statue inside it of an official. And the Egyptians called people from Western Asia or from Canaan, they called them Asiatic. So you'll see that term there. So right now that means Western Asia in this context. So generally the land of Canaan. And how do we know that he was Asiatic or from Canaan? It's because you see, it looks like he's wearing this strange hat, sort of looks like a mushroom head. Well, that's actually his hair, but that's how the Egyptians artistically depicted Asiatics when they made statues. So there's another statue that's similar to this, same kind of hairstyle head there. But this tells us that there were indeed people who had come from Canaan, who moved in there, who lived in this Avaris Ramses city, and there were a couple who even achieved a high rank within the government because they had these statues made, and a large tomb was made for them. They weren't just regular people. Now, what about those sheep and the sheep remains? That's very, very interesting because the Egyptians themselves were not really big on shepherding and keeping sheep. In fact, if you look through ancient Egyptian artwork, you will see, if you're looking for it or not see, you'll notice there is an absence of sheep in their artwork. They'll show other animals, cows especially, they show a lot of, but where are the sheep? But they don't seem to like the sheep. And we read in Genesis 46, 33, and 34 that Joseph advises his family to go to the Pharaoh and tell him that they're shepherds and they want to live in Goshen. That's this Nile Delta region. He says, for every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. So they didn't like sheep and shepherding for whatever reason. Now there's an inscription from this pre-Exodus period. It was commissioned by the Pharaoh Queen Hatshepsut, and she's talking about fixing things in this Nile Delta region. And she says, I have raised up what was dismembered beginning from the time the Asiatics were in the midst of the Delta in Avaris with vagrants, and some people translate this as shepherds, in their midst, toppling what had been made. They ruled without the sun. So she's saying, I fixed some things. It was ruined supposedly when the Asiatics were living all over the Delta and specifically in the city of Avaris. And then she mentions these vagrants or shepherds there. And she says they ruled without the sun. So they didn't worship the Egyptian sun god Ra. So we know these are not Egyptians that she's talking about. And it seems like there were shepherds living there, and they were people who had come over from Canaan. So that fits what we know about the Israelites, although it doesn't say the Hebrews or the Israelites. But there's a way that we can see some evidence of that, or check, were there Hebrews living in Egypt? Were there people with Hebrew names, biblical names, living in Egypt? And we can see that yes, there were. So I'm going to show you 3 examples of that. The first one we have is the picture here is the scarab. It's a scarab seal. So these were little beetles that they would make. They looked like beetles, but on the flat side of them, they would often have an inscription like this one does in hieroglyphs. And this one reads Jacob El, or Jacob El, using Egyptian hieroglyphs. And it dates to around 1700 BC. So this is about the time of Joseph and Jacob, and 9 of these were actually found at Avaris or Ramses. Okay, 2 names for the same place. It's over time the name of this city region changed. And then 3 of these were found outside of the Tel El Dava area, and there's actually several others that we don't know exactly where they came from. But there's 9 that were found there. So what's this tell us? It's not necessarily that this is a scarab seal of Jacob from the book of Genesis, but it at least tells us that people with the name Jacob lived there in Avaris or in Ramses in the time of Jacob and Joseph and prior to the Exodus. And this is not only a Semitic name, okay, Hebrew is part of the Semitic language of family, Semitic language family, but we also have something that's actually specifically a biblical Hebrew name. Another name that we have is Jesse. This is found on what's called an ostracon. So it's a piece of pottery with writing on it. It was used like note paper in ancient times. And again, this comes from the pre-Exodus period. So Jesse, of course, is a name that we find for a Hebrew and Israelite in the Hebrew Bible. But even more compelling is another artifact called Papyrus Brooklyn. So this is dated to the 13th dynasty of Egypt, which, if we were to put it in a more specific BC dating, we could say somewhere around 1700 to 1620 BC, and that's based on a pharaoh's name that's found on the papyrus. But this lists slaves or servants in a household in Egypt. That might not seem that interesting, but there are a couple of special things about this papyrus. First of all, alongside the names on the list, they're given a new Egyptian name. This is just like what happened to Joseph. So Joseph is given this new Egyptian name at some point once he's become a servant of Pharaoh. But in addition to that, part of their original names, we have several names that are biblical Hebrew names. So here we have a list of those. Some of these are feminine versions of male names that you may be familiar with from the Bible, and that's because household servants in Egypt were more typically women, and they had the men working in construction or out in the fields more often. So we have a feminine version of Menahem and a feminine version of Asher. We have Shiphrah, which is one of the names of the midwives in Exodus chapter 1. We have a feminine version of Jacob. We have the name Job, although that might not exactly be a Hebrew name. We have another name similar to Issachar, that's feminine. We have David, a compound name with David. We have a Hebrew name that is not attested in the Bible, but it indeed is Hebrew, a Sebto. And then we have Chaya, or Eve. And then finally, it looks like somebody had the name Hebrew. Actually, their name was Hebrew. So here's a list just to break it down for you, and some references in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, for you to see that. So we've got Jacob attested in a couple of places, actually. Jesse, Menahem, Asher, Shiphrah, Issachar, David, Sebto, Eve, and Hebrew. All right, so we count that out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 biblical Hebrew names, we could say. If we removed a Sebto and this Hebrew one as a name, then still we've got 8. But This seems to be pretty compelling evidence that there were Hebrew people with their Hebrew names living in Egypt prior to the Exodus. So then we get on to the next part of the story, and that is the eventual enslavement of the Hebrews. And we're told in Exodus 1:8 that a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And then he begins the enslavement. So Joseph died, and then sometime after that, a Pharaoh arose who did not know him. Now, it doesn't give the name, but looking at Egyptian history and looking at the timeline, we can give a good guess, at least, to who this Pharaoh was. So I would say that it was Pharaoh Ahmose the first. And why didn't he know Joseph? Is because he was from a different dynasty. So he was actually ruling in the south, and they came back up to the north to take over because there had been a split in Egypt prior to that. And so he wouldn't have known anything about Joseph because he wouldn't have been connected to Joseph's government. Also, why would this guy enslave the Hebrews and other people from Canaan? Well, because this Egyptian dynasty he was part of, they blamed people from Canaan for taking over the northern part of their country, which they sort of did, but as far as we can tell, it wasn't really a military attack that happened. It was just sort of people had moved in there and they had formed their own rulers in their own government. So he drove out the leaders of that movement. They're called the Hyksos. And then he reunified Egypt under an Egyptian pharaoh. And then he started a policy of widespread slavery in Egypt, particularly of Asiatics or people from Western Asia. And in fact, the Egyptian word for those people, Asiatic, the word was Amu. This became synonymous with slave in the 18th dynasty. So basically, it was assumed that if somebody was from Western Asia, from Canaan area, then they were a slave in Egypt because that was the policy of the government. And that sounds a whole lot like what we read in Exodus 1. So the Hebrews then are enslaved prior to the birth of Moses. And here I've put a tentative timeline there for you to look at. This is based on biblical numbers, chronology, but also matching it up to Egyptian history. So Joseph dies, and then we see about 30, 34 years later, the new Pharaoh comes in there and conquers the north, and he starts this 18th dynasty. He enslaves people. And then about 45 years after that, almost, we have the birth of Moses. So Moses is born at a time when everybody's already enslaved. That's what we see in the text of Exodus. Now they are told that they have to do all this slave labor and this building and so forth. What do we see in Egyptian history that might connect to that? Well, here's one document, a papyrus that is from the reign of Pharaoh Thutmose III around 1450 BC or a little bit earlier. So this seems to be from just some years before the Exodus. Remember, we put that around 1446 BC. And it tells us that people who had migrated into Egypt, they were forced into labor from after the Hyksos were kicked out, from when this new pharaoh came in, all the way through Thutmose III, and they are forced to do things like build public buildings. All right, so instead of paying people, the pharaoh decides he's just going to make these non-Egyptians do it for free. Now, the Hebrews are not mentioned specifically. There's no, the Hebrews were enslaved, the Israelites were enslaved, but the Egyptians didn't work like that. They didn't talk about individual tribes of people, really. They just called people from over here. They were from Western Asia, and you had the Libyans here and the Nubians down there and so forth. So they just kind of talked about people from larger geographic regions. Well, we also read in the beginning of Exodus, we read about some of the slave labor that is involved. in brick making. And that is something that we see again in Egyptian artwork. So this is from the tomb of Rekhmirah, who was a vizier. So he's a very high official under Pharaoh Thutmose III, so just before the Exodus. And if you can see on this, on the bottom panel here, we have some Semitic slaves and also some Nubian slaves. They are making mud bricks. Okay, these are the bricks stacked up. And then they're actually carrying these bricks over. And if you followed this panel farther and farther, you would actually see them working on buildings. And there's some agricultural work going on too. So we've got slaves making mud bricks. They're Semitic. They're people who had come over from Canaan. Exodus also talks about quotas for the bricks, Exodus 5, 6 through 8. And the Pharaoh says to the taskmasters in charge and the foreman in charge, he says that they're not supposed to give the people, the enslaved people, straw to make bricks as previously. They got to go get it themselves. But he says they still have to make the same amount of bricks, which they were before. So he's making them do more work. He's making it even more difficult. This is a picture from modern Egypt of the same type of mud bricks. Same thing that you saw in the previous slide from the 15th century BC. They're still making them like this in some places in Egypt. So you see all the straw here, and then this clay, it's basically dirt clay. The straw makes it stick together better. So when you take that away and you don't have straw to use, these bricks, they fall apart. They just don't work as well. And they're harder to make. And so that what was the result of that is that they didn't meet their quota. They weren't able to make enough correct bricks. And we see that in Egyptian texts too. The most pertinent here is called the Louvre leather roll. This comes from a bit after the Exodus, 170 years after about, but it's the same general time period in Egyptian history, the New Kingdom, and it talks about these quotas of mud bricks and their failure. So we have here it's listing the names and 2,000 bricks. That was their quota, and it tells how many arrived in these different shipments. And then there's a deficit of 370. And it says they weren't able to gather the required amount of straw. So they had a similar problem. And then they were beaten. The slaves were beaten because they didn't make their quota. Of course, that's what we see in the Exodus story also. So very accurate in terms of Egypt in that time period. So we at least can see that the writer of Exodus knew what he was talking about in terms of ancient Egypt in this New Kingdom period. But there's some other details that we can look at. For example, in Exodus 1, we read that the Israelites were forced to make these storage facilities, and it says that they were supposed to build them in Ramses, Pithom, and Heliopolis. Now, the excavations at Ramses or Avaris have been quite extensive, and they found something very interesting there. This is from the excavator. He wrote that they found enormous storage facilities set up, among them numerous silos, and then also a new palatial compound of the 18th dynasty was constructed. So the 18th dynasty, remember, that was this period in Egyptian history where the Exodus would fit in the 15th century BC. And he says that they had built these big storage facilities there, and also there was a palace in Avaris or in Ramses. So this could be what Exodus 1 is talking about there. We also see the palace mentioned in Exodus 7. That was used by the pharaohs up there in the north along this river, just like we read through the Exodus narrative. The princess, she rescued Moses as he was floating down the river by the palace. And, that's one marker in Exodus we see where the palace was located by the river, and indeed that's what excavations at Ramses found. Now, Heliopolis, or On, as it's called in Egyptian, this is another location that's mentioned. It's actually in the Septuagint of Exodus 1:11. So depending on what Bible translation you're looking at, it may or may not mention that. But this was also a city that we know was in existence in the pre-Exodus period, all the way through the Exodus time. And we do know that there was also building that was done there by or under the command of the Pharaoh who was in power just before the Exodus. So we at least know there was building going on, people living there at that time. Just a minute ago, I mentioned Moses being rescued by the princess floating down the Nile by the palace. And we have a pretty good idea of who this princess or daughter of Pharaoh might have been because of the alignment of the timeline, and also because she's really the only princess that was around, that was alive at that time. So this is Hatshepsut. She's pretty famous in Egyptian history because she was both a queen and a pharaoh. So she took over as pharaoh, even though she was a woman, and she ruled for about 22 years. We would say early in the life of Moses. Now she was the only child of Pharaoh Thutmose I and the queen who survived past infancy. So that's why I mentioned she's really our only possibility in that time period. None of her brothers and sisters, none of her sisters especially, survived. They weren't around. And indeed, in Egyptian times, ancient Egyptian times, they did call the princess's daughter of the king. So same kind of language there. Now, of course, we can say, all right, that fits this timeline. That's fine. She's the only one around. But is there anything else that might connect the two? Well, in fact, there seems to be. And that is backlash against Hatshepsut later on after the Exodus. It's a very odd thing that if you go through ancient Egypt, you see the monuments of Hatshepsut were destroyed and defaced. So on the right there, that picture you see, originally Hatshepsut was in the middle. Now you just see some blank, broken out pieces with gods on each side of her. And that happened all over Egypt. And they would even scratch out her name, where her name was inscribed in hieroglyphs. And sometimes the name was replaced by this pharaoh, Amenhotep II, or his queen. So he was the one that did it, Amenhotep II. And Egyptologists have been questioning why did Hatshepsut get defaced like this? And they've offered explanations like, oh, she disturbed the natural order of things in Egypt. She was a female pharaoh, etc. Well, there were other female pharaohs, and the same thing didn't happen to them. But if she was the daughter of Pharaoh who rescued and adopted Moses, and Moses, of course, was the one who led the Exodus, then it's understandable that the Pharaoh of the Exodus might have blamed Hatshepsut partially for the events and the destruction that happened to Egypt as a result of that, and sort of put her on the bad guys' team. That's really, I think, our best explanation at this point. So what about this Pharaoh who did that to Hatshepsut's images and names? The Pharaoh. Who was this Pharaoh? I think that we can give a pretty solid argument for who the Pharaoh of the Exodus is based on a number of reasons, not just based on the chronology that we're looking at, the timeline that we're looking at, but other reasons. So first, we had just looked at the Hatshepsut issue and who did that, Amenhotep II. Now, the second thing that we should look at is that the Pharaoh who came before the Exodus, he must have had a reign of at least or over 40 years. Why? Because Moses left for 40 years. When he killed that Egyptian, he left Egypt for 40 years until he was told that the Pharaoh who knew him had died. So that Pharaoh stayed alive, stayed in power for 40 years while Moses was gone. Well, if we look at Egyptian history at this in this broad time period, actually, the only Pharaoh who had a reign of 40 or more years around that time period was Thutmose III. He reigned for 54 years. In fact, in all of Egyptian history, there are very few pharaohs who reigned for 40 or more years. So it really narrows things down a lot. Now, the other thing we see is that the Exodus Pharaoh must have also recently taken power or been made the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Okay, so his father died or his predecessor died. He came into power. Moses went back. Some various things happened, the discussions, the plagues, etc., and then the Exodus happened. So there wasn't a lot of time in between the beginning of his reign and the Exodus. And from Egyptian records, Egyptian history, we see that Amenhotep II became the pharaoh only about 4 years before the Exodus, so not very long. On the right there is a statue of Amenhotep II. So he comes into power, Moses comes back, they start talking, and then what happens? The plagues, right? So a question that I often get, and many archaeologists working on this Exodus issue, is there any evidence of the Exodus plagues? Did the Egyptians say anything about that? Now, we actually shouldn't expect the Egyptians to have talked about in their official records the plagues, because it reflected poorly on them. It basically showed that their pharaoh and their gods were powerless. And in ancient times in Egypt and other cultures of that region, the kings, the official records, did not talk about their losses or failures. So we wouldn't expect it in their official records. However, it's possible that it could be preserved in some other unofficial record, if you will. Well, there is a very, very interesting Egyptian papyrus that is sometimes called the Ipuwer papyrus, or the Dialogue of Ipuwer and the Lord of All is a longer name for it. And it is a poem in lamentation form written by a man named Ipuwer, a wise man, or a bard, actually, we should probably call him. He wrote songs, he wrote poetry that was put to music. And he is responding to probably the god Ra, and also to the pharaoh, criticizing them, actually. And this is because of all the terrible things that have happened in Egypt. And if you read through the poem, you see death, destruction, natural order is thrown by the wayside, and the gods of Egypt and the pharaoh of Egypt are powerless. So the people look at this and they read Exodus and they notice some parallels, and they wonder, oh, could this be the Egyptians talking about the Exodus plagues? Well, typically, scholars of ancient Egyptian literature or Egyptology, they date this papyrus earlier than the Exodus, but we only have one copy of this papyrus. You see it in the photograph there, and that copy dates to the 13th century BC. So this is a little bit after the Exodus, which means whatever it's talking about happened prior, so that is okay. Yes, most scholars date the composition of it to, let's say, 150 to 400 years before the Exodus. All right, but they don't do that based on objective criteria. They do it because they are understanding this poem as an allegory, which is describing what's called the second intermediate, or some even say the first intermediate period of Egypt. So these are times when Egypt wasn't unified under one king. And so they're saying, oh, it's just an allegorical rendition of some political turmoil, not recording historical events. But if we look into the details of linguistics, words and phrases that are used, then we see that actually it has an 18th dynasty date, or at the very least, it was rewritten in the 18th dynasty. And then they preserved that language later on in the 19th dynasty from when this papyrus is dated to. So it seems odd that they changed the language once, but then when they copied it again, they didn't update it. So it seems to have been composed in the 18th dynasty. The other clue we have is the Ipuwer, the author's name. His name appears in a text from the period of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, so right before the Exodus. He's also at least another Ipuwer, probably the same one, but it was a famous bard, as I mentioned earlier, in ancient Egypt. So he seems to be connected to this pre-Exodus period, and he would write poetry or songs. Now, why do some people think that this poem might describe the time of the Exodus plagues? Well, we have several reasons. I'm just going to summarize a few of the most interesting points. But first of all, it states the river is blood, and also states blood is everywhere throughout the land of Egypt. And this is the thing that was noticed the first. Because it's very odd, and yet obviously it connects well to the Exodus story with the Nile River being turned to blood. The poem also talks about how the land of Egypt is injured. So there's a lot of bad things destroying the land. Talks about plague and pestilence. We see that with the plagues. Talks about herds of cattle. There's things happening to them so that they're in pain. And again, we see that in the Exodus plagues. It talks about people who are having their hair falling out, and they're in such extreme pain that they want to die. Something like the plague of the boils and might be connected to that. Trees and plants are destroyed, food's gone. So something's ruining all these things. What is it? Children of different classes have died. So there are children who are dying. It says, the day does not dawn on the land of Egypt. That sounds a lot like, or connects well, at least to the idea of the 3 days of darkness. It says, the king is removed, the palace is fallen. So something's happened to the pharaoh, the royal house. It says, the power of Ra, the sun god, is not seen. Again, this could also connect to the darkness, but it certainly connects to the idea that the Egyptian gods are powerless here. And that is a critique of the author. The gods of Egypt are absent. He talks about that. He talks about it like there's no pilot at the steering wheel. And then finally, the servants, they take and wear gold, silver, and precious stones. And this is the same thing that we see the Israelites doing at the end, just before they depart Egypt. So certainly many, many parallels there. Now, that last plague was the death of the firstborn. And we read in Exodus that the firstborn, even of the Pharaoh, died. And there's something in Egyptian history that seems to connect to that also. You've probably all heard of and seen pictures of the Great Sphinx at Giza. Well, in between his paws, there is a stele, so this big inscribed stone. And that was put there by Pharaoh Thutmose IV. So he was the he was the son of Amenhotep II. He was the successor, the next pharaoh. And on that stele, he talks about how one day he was out hunting and he went and he fell down to take a nap. And the god of the Sphinx came to him in a dream and told him that he was going to become the pharaoh and gave him a divine blessing and endorsement for that. So this seems to be, and this is the general idea in Egyptology, that Thutmose IV was not originally going to be the pharaoh. So he had an older brother actually who died. In Egyptian text, it doesn't say how he died. He just disappears. But he wasn't supposed to be the successor. And so he has this text made to make it sound like the Egyptian gods had predicted that all along and endorsed him so that there won't be some struggle for the throne. He's the proper divinely blessed Pharaoh. But his brother, something happened to his brother. So was that the death of the firstborn? It certainly, again, fits what we're seeing with the timeline with Amenhotep II events of the Exodus. What about Amenhotep II himself? Well, he fits the general character profile of the Exodus pharaoh. For example, he was one of the most arrogant pharaohs in Egyptian history. He made some really crazy claims, like he said that he could shoot arrows through a copper target a palm thick. So this thick of copper, he said he could shoot arrows through there. That's really not possible. He said that he rowed a ship faster and farther than 200 Egyptian sailors by himself. Okay, he was super powered. Talks about how he single-handedly killed 7 prince warriors of Kadesh when they were fighting a battle. And then he talks about how all these kings of other major kingdoms would come and pay tribute to him like he was the greatest king in the world. And then he also has this stele, this stone inscription, where he talks about conducting a slave raid into Canaan. And the number of slaves that he says he takes back are by far the largest ever in Egyptian history. So that one we will look at in just a minute. But there was also a decline of the military in his reign. His father, Thutmose III, had been one of the most powerful pharaohs, conducted that we know of 17 major military campaigns. And yet, we go to the next pharaoh, Amenhotep II, there's almost nothing that happens. So he has an initial campaign early on in his reign as pharaoh before the Exodus. And then after that, the only thing we see is this slave raid into Canaan that we're going to look at. And then for about 100 years, the Egyptians do basically nothing with their military. So it seems like something affected their military. Was that the pursuit of the Israelites into the Reed Sea, and then they lose so many of their chariots and army? We also see that the palace was abandoned around the time of the Exodus. The excavators say they're not sure why, but they suggest that it was because of a plague. Now, they're not thinking of the Egyptian plagues, but they found it odd that this palace was abandoned. Something drastic happened. Now to that slave raid into Canaan that I mentioned before. So it's on a record of Amenhotep II called the Memphis Stele, and he says that he carried off 101,128 prisoners to be slaves in Egypt, and they're people from Canaan. So it sounds like he's claiming that he went and replenished the slave population that had been lost in the Exodus. He doesn't claim in the text that these are people that left and then he got them back. Maybe he didn't even want to acknowledge that had happened, or maybe that was inferred, or maybe he's like, okay, those people are gone, but look, I replaced them with better people. So he seems to be trying to give propaganda to his people, like, oh, look, I fixed things. Now, if you look at the other numbers for Egyptian campaigns where they take captives as slaves, so much less. Look at this, 5,903 is the largest one besides that. So Egyptologists think that he's just grossly exaggerating here, and probably what he was doing. He was probably just trying to make it look like he got a slave force back. Now, in Egyptian sources, generally there's nothing about the Exodus, but we go a little bit later in Egyptian history, and we see there is an interesting source. It's from Manetho, who is a priest historian who lived in the 4th and 3rd century BC. So yeah, it's over 1,100 years after the Exodus. It's a long time, but he was an Egyptian historian and he had access to Egyptian records that we no longer have. This was still the time of ancient Egypt. And he, in fact, does identify what we could call an exodus of the Israelites. And he talks about these people who lived in Egypt and they left with their whole families and all their things went through the wilderness, and then they got to Syria, he calls it. So that was what the region was called later on. And he says they built a city in that country, which is now called Judea, called it Jerusalem. So we know that he's associating these people who left Egypt with Israelites because of that. But the other interesting thing is that he identifies the Pharaoh in power during this exit of Egypt with a Pharaoh named Amenephis. Now, Amenephis is the Greek rendition of Amenhotep. And so he is saying that the Pharaoh of this Exodus was named Amenhotep. And we've just been talking about Amenhotep II. So this seems to be confirmed, at least from a later Egyptian source. Now, in just finishing up here, uh, people often ask about things like the sea crossing and so forth. There's good possibilities where it may have happened. We couldn't pinpoint it exactly, but in Exodus 14:2, it does give us 4 geographical markers, and these are things that are also mentioned in Egyptian texts of the time that help us to identify it. So we have Pi Hahiroth, which means mouth of the canal. We have Migdal, which is a word for fortress. We have Baal Zephon, which is a god. This is a manifestation of a Canaanite god, probably referring to a place where his temple or his center of worship was. And then the sea, or the Sea of Reeds. So we have here, there were canals that were made between these lakes on the eastern border of Egypt. And so the mouth of the canal would be one of the openings. So there's some different options there, obviously, we can see, but we can kind of make X marks there. Second is Migdal, so fortresses. Along this road, this dotted line is a road that went into Canaan. The Egyptians put fortresses because this was their border, and they didn't want, at that time, they didn't want people just coming in. They're trying to protect their border and keep out people from Canaan. So the Migdal area is probably up along this road somewhere, let's say in the north. And obviously the mouth of the canal is going to be south of that. Then we have Baal Zephon. Well, at this city here, Tel Defene, Tafanhes was one of the ancient names for it. There was a center of worship for Baal Zephon, so possibly is referring to that geographical marker. And then the sea is on the east, the Sea of Reeds, so one of these sea areas. And so when we look at that, it seems like the crossing was in this region here. Maybe it's what called the El Bala Lakes or Lake Timsa. So that's a possibility there. This is an Egyptian piece of inscribed artwork that actually shows one of the reed seas. So it's kind of hard to see in the actual stone inscription, but this drawing you might be able to see a little bit better. These lines here, they're reeds, and there's the waterway, and there's some fish in there. And that was a place that the Egyptians referred to as the reeds, or the Reed Sea. So they had the same kind of idea. These reeds were growing around the water, and that's what we see in the Hebrew of Exodus when it's talking about the Reed Sea, or what many people call the Red Sea. It didn't actually say Red Sea in the Hebrew text. Finally, the last thing we'll get to, and we'll talk about this actually a little bit tomorrow morning, but they leave Egypt and they start wandering. So they're nomads, they're wanderers. And we don't really have much evidence of nomads from ancient times because they don't build cities and make pottery, and they're just camping and moving around. But there is an Egyptian inscription that mentions the nomads of Yahweh. Now, the ancient Israelites were the only people in ancient times who worshiped Yahweh. So nobody else, we have no evidence that any other group of people worshiped Yahweh. If you did worship Yahweh, you would join Israel. So that's why we can be certain that the Egyptians are referring to Israelites here, the nomads of Yahweh, the nomads who worship Yahweh. And they're placing them contextually east of Egypt as nomads, as wanderers, in the area of Edom or Moab or possibly Canaan. Okay, so this is actually dated to about 1400 BC. So it's just about 40 years after the Exodus, and that's where we would expect the Israelites to be at the end of the wandering period, or maybe they had just entered into Canaan. Numbers 16:41 says the sons of Israel are the people of Yahweh, right? And connecting that there to the nomads of Yahweh. And then it also tells us that the Egyptians and even the Pharaoh himself, they were familiar with the name Yahweh for God. And how? Because they must have had interaction with the Israelites. And so that is more evidence that the Israelites were in Egypt and the Egyptians were familiar with them. But then they left Egypt and they were wandering east of Egypt. Eventually, they end up in Canaan, and that's what we're going to look at tomorrow morning with Joshua. So, in summary, we have for Egypt, we've got Semites or Asiatics, people from Canaan in Egypt. Archaeology shows us that. There are several Hebrew names that we find in Egypt in the pre-Exodus period. There's slavery, mud bricks, building projects like in Ramses or Avaris that we saw in this pre-Exodus period. There's this possible poetic account of the plagues by Ipuwer. The palace was abandoned at that time by some calamity. Hatshepsut's images and names were defaced and sometimes written over by Amenhotep II, who also did a post-Exodus slave raid into Canaan. Seems like he was trying to claim that he brought slaves back. There's a decline of the military. His successor, Thutmose IV, had to get that divine promise of kingship because his brother mysteriously died and disappeared. And then again, this nomads of Yahweh inscription telling us that the Egyptians were indeed familiar with Yahweh with the Israelites. And then these people had left and started wandering in the wilderness. So contrary to what many modern scholars claim, there actually is a great deal of archaeological evidence.
Can't get this to go off.
For the Israelites in Egypt and for the Exodus events. So with that, we can really say that there's a large amount of evidence for the Exodus, and we can be confident that it was a historical event. And as time goes on and more discoveries are made, we're going to probably find more evidence for this and be able to say even more strongly that the Exodus actually occurred. So that will conclude the presentation for this evening. And again, if you have any questions, we're going to do those during the Q&A tomorrow afternoon.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kennedy. I haven't heard of most of that evidence at all, and it's very interesting. I've, focused on there's no evidence on the ground of those many people moving through, but as you say, they were nomads and they did not build. But thank you very much. I'm very pleased to have heard this, and I'm really looking forward to tomorrow to hear some more. I want to thank all of you for being here this evening, and come back tomorrow morning at 9:30 for the next presentation. Tad, would you put up the slide for how to access that? If you take a look at the Zoom link, it's the same as it was this evening. And then the normal Zoom link for the worship service at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning. Let us have prayer before we go. Lord God in heaven, thank you so much for this information and this documentation and these things that surround the Exodus. We're grateful for your leading and for your guidance in all things. Please bless us tonight. Give us a good night's rest that we may enjoy tomorrow. We ask this in your name. Amen. Well, good night and thank you so much. And I'll see you tomorrow morning.